What's up, everybody? Very excited to be here today. We are going to be talking about the movie Freaky, which if you have not seen it, highly recommend. It's directed by one of my favorite up-and-coming directors who's actually been around quite a lot longer than most people think. We're here talking today with Chris Landon, the director of Happy Death Day. Happy Death Day to you. Scout's Guide to the Zombie Apocalypse, which I honestly did not realize until I was doing more research about this movie. I love that movie, by the way. I think it's hilarious. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm kind of fixated on your amazing t-shirt.
Thank you so much.
So good.
To be completely honest with you, I walked into Happy Death Day 3 years ago, and I had seen the trailer, and I kind of knew a little bit about it. And I was at a convention in Long Beach, and I walked in, and then I got this movie, and I was like, this is an amazing movie. And then we got the sequel, and now we got this. Why? Because I was reading a little bit, and you were talking a little bit about horror and comedy and how sometimes when people see those two things together, they tend to sometimes be turned off by it. Why does it work for you?
I think it works for me because I think I find life in general both horrifying and really amusing.
The definition of 2020.
and they tend to kind of really sort of blend together. I've always had a sort of a gallows humor approach to life. And it's probably a coping mechanism, but yeah, I've always loved the way they can play off of each other. And I'm also, I'm a huge movie nut. And especially horror, and I think that's pretty evident. But I just think that it sometimes feels like I get to have my cake and eat it too, because I can cover so many things and pack so much into one movie by straddling multiple genres, which is tricky. It's a tricky thing to pull off, but I always kind of feel like if your heart's really in it, it's possible. So some of my favorite movies are horror comedies.
In terms of this year, because of everything that's been happening, how difficult was it for you guys to actually finish this movie? Because I assume at some point you probably had to go into a remote post-production phase.
Yeah. Talk about horror comedies. 2020 is the ultimate horror comedy.
Yeah, it's true.
But yes, it was. I had to completely post the movie during this pandemic, which definitely proved challenging, but also I'm so grateful that we have the technology to achieve it, that I can do things like remote editing and do Zoom sessions with Bear McCreary, our composer, so we could finish the movie, but it was definitely challenging. And just took a little bit longer, I think, than it normally would have.
And speaking of which, now that we've kind of been in this, and I know you've probably been spending most of your time finishing this film, how has the pandemic potentially inspired you creatively in terms of your writing, or maybe if you've been visualizing some future project? Has that been a hindrance, or has it actually been in a weird way somewhat beneficial?
I would say that the pandemic has been a total inspiration boner killer.
That's fair.
It's been numbingly depressing. No, look, I've been really busy. I've been writing stuff. None of it is pandemic related. I don't think anybody. It's funny. I remember when it began, everyone was like, "Oh, there's going to be so many pandemic thrillers."
Right. Then reality sinks in of the situation. You're like,
I just want to escape. I want to get the fuck out of here. Pardon my French. So, no. I had some stuff that was lined up before this began, and so I had those sort of these writing obligations and some new stuff that I jumped into. So I've kept really busy. I think the bigger challenge hasn't been a creative one, it's been a logistical one. It's been so how do I write from home? How do I do it when my kids are here? How do I, because I'm like a cliched writer in the sense that I would go to coffee shops and sit in a corner and look cool and broody, and then now I'm in my house with chaos all around me. So it's just managing stuff more than the creative thing. But I've been so impressed / annoyed by people who have like figured out greatness in the midst of all this terrifying stuff, you know, like hats off to them, especially like a lot of like, I think the focus for me has been more like on musicians and artists who have put out like amazing albums and then, you know, in the middle of a pandemic.
So I had a chance to watch the film last week, and when it was announced, I was very excited because I love Happy Death Day and Happy Death Day 2. Like, I genuinely like love those movies. They're so good. And I love how different the sequel was from the first one and how you took different genres and, you know, kind of melded them together. I loved that. So I was really excited about this. And I know there was like a little bit of conversation that I saw online about, you know, you casting Vince Vaughn as sort of the serial killer of the film. And to me, it was kind of genius because if you had seen some of his other work like Domestic Violence versus Wedding Crashers, it really made sense. Was that kind of what like helped spark that idea of casting, or what was that process like?
Honestly, it wasn't even like a spark. It was sort of like is there anyone else on the planet who could do this?
Yeah.
Better than Vince Vaughn, you know?
Right.
I mean? There's the Vince that is, you know, very intimidating and really intense and sort of like, that's like the cell block Vince or the psycho Vince. But then there's of course Wedding Crashers Vince. And so I knew that I needed a guy who would be convincingly terrifying and scary, but also somebody that is unbelievably charming and likable and funny. And that's Vince, you know, like he's all of that. And he's also like a legit actor. And I didn't want him doing some sort of like lame, cutesy impersonation of a teenage girl. Like I knew he'd invest in the character. And that's what I was after, because if you don't get the audience to buy into this concept, and if you don't get them to care about her, then there's no movie. And I knew that he would go there. And that was part of the joy of rehearsing and sort of doing all the sort of pre-production stuff that we did together, because like Vince and Kathryn both are very serious actors and really committed to it. You know, they weren't acting like they were in a horror comedy. I think that that's what ultimately works about the movie. And it's why I think people responded so strongly to the Happy Death Day movies, because you have a performance like Jessica Roth, like who is fully committed. And that's, for me as a director, that's always paramount. Like it's the most important aspect of filmmaking is hopefully you have a good script and find the right actor.
That's a huge testament to, I think, all of the movies that I've seen that you've made. Is there something that you kind of look for in everyone that you think kind of crosses no matter what movie or script it is, or is it very individual to every single script?
It's very individual, I think, to each script, because I mean, look, I'm always looking for, and it's something that's very, it's hard to put your finger on. And I always tell people that it's a bit like dating. There's always a love at first sight kind of spark that happens. And because I tend to write, I mean, I have written all the movies I've directed, so I know these characters really well in my head. And so, you know, you've kind of lived with these people in your head. So when I'm auditioning or looking for an actor, I already know who they are and I'm waiting for them to walk through the door. And so often I'll know who it is before they even open their mouth. And that's the joy and the fun of casting. The bigger roll of the dice, and I think most directors will agree, is when you do decide to try and cast famous people, bigger name people who will never audition for you, who will never walk, like you are purely relying on your instinct and their sort of, you know, body of work that you've seen before. And so that was the case with Vince and Kathryn, but I knew in my gut that they were right.
I was doing a little bit of reading, and your writing partner on this film, Michael Kennedy, talked about how he wrote this and kind of pitched it to you. And before you guys took it to Blumhouse to actually pitch it as a project, you guys did a lot of rewriting. What was it about the draft that you got versus where you wanted to take it? Like, how much of a change was that? And was it very detailed stuff, or was it a little bit of general stuff?
There actually wasn't a draft. Michael approached me with a pitch. He was going to go out and pitch the idea to a bunch of places, and he wanted my help and just sort of like hearing it out and if I had any thoughts. And he pitched me the idea, and I just started I was a barrage of ideas that I started to throw out at him. And then about 20, 30 minutes into our conversation, we just realized that this was something that we should write together. So we actually sat down physically together and wrote it from scratch. So it was really easy to kind of sync up and get this thing written very quickly. Like I think we wrote the first draft together in about less than 3 weeks.
Wow.
And then we were kind of off to the races.
When it comes to writing, you know, how you approach certain characters' demises, how do you think about that? Because they're very creative in this movie. And I was watching them like, oh man, this is great. I've never seen something like this before. What's sort of the approach to that? Are you just kind of like putting ideas on a wall and then being like, what's the best one? Or does it just kind of come to you at a random moment?
It usually comes to me at a random moment. And I've always had a weird knack for bizarre deaths. And I don't know why, but I am the architect of these bizarre deaths. And I usually start, you know, when I'm writing a scene, you know, you obviously kind of need to go with what you have, like what's your main setting. And so, you know, that tends to sort of at least be the starting point for me. But it's really easy for me to walk. Like I could walk into basically any room anywhere and find a way to kill you in a way that I hope you haven't seen before. I'm very fortunate to work with some awesome people. And I think what's really cool is that a lot of the people that work on these films, they become emotionally invested in them too. Like I always want everyone to watch the films and not just sort of like, oh, I'm going to be a hired hand and work on one little piece of it.
Are you always thinking of things that you maybe like saw from childhood? You're like, oh, how can I spin this in a crazy way?
Yeah, if I have a brand, I think it's about taking sort of known properties or known concepts and ideas and inverting them somehow.
Is there like a franchise or something that's established or hasn't been remade or redone in years and years and years, decades potentially, that you would love to either just straight do a new version of, or is there something that you want to maybe try to mix it with something else?
There have been, I mean, look, there's the movie that I'm currently working on now, which is, it's something I'm hoping that I'm going to make with Netflix, is certainly another kind of weird mashup of things. And it's entirely its own entity. I would describe it as sort of like E.T. meets Beetlejuice. I actually tried for years to do a remake of Christine. I was obsessed with it because I related to the Arnie character. I was very drawn to the story of a misfit, you know, and his car. And I love the book. I love the Carpenter film because it's iconic in its own ways. And there are things that Carpenter couldn't do at the time that we could do now. So that was something that I was obsessed with and tried forever. And also just because I live in LA and we have such a huge car culture that I thought there was a really fun way to kind of reinvent and modernize that. It's sort of post Fast and Furious, you know?
So my last question before we wrap out here, are you any closer to a Happy Death Day 3?
No. I wish I were.
Darn.
It's such a bummer. I wish we were. And I don't know. We all keep banging the drum together. I know Jason wants to do it. The whole cast wants to do it. I want to do it. I have a really cool idea for it. And we'll see. Maybe one day.
Hopefully. I hope. Fingers crossed. Chris Landon, thank you so much for your time.
If
you haven't seen Freaky yet, everybody, please go check it out. It's amazing. It's hilarious. It's unique. So thank you so much for your time. Very much appreciate it.